the winter of 1836, the high ridges of the Green River Valley. A wind that carried no sound but its own high, thin scream moved across the landscape, polishing the ice on the pines and grinding snow crystals into a fine, suffocating powder. The air itself was a predator, a solid, searching cold that found every gap, every loose thread, every pinprick hole in a man's defense. Jedediah Sampson felt it as a physical weight, a presence trying to force its way through his ribs and stop his heart. He was moving along the high trap line, the one everyone called the Ridge Trail, and he was failing. His clothing, which had seemed so sturdy back at the rendezvous near Horse Creek, was betraying him. His buckskin leggings, soaked from a misstep into an overflow spring 2 days prior, were now frozen solid. They were no longer leather, they were planks of ice, cracking and splitting with every high step he took through the drift. With each movement, the ice-choked seams ground sharp crystals into his skin, rubbing his knees and thighs raw. His wool capote, a heavy garment bought from the American Fur Company, was little better. It was a sponge for moisture, his own sweat from the climb, and the driven snow that had plastered it. It weighed a good 30 pounds more than it should, a sodden, frozen burden that offered no warmth, only a suffocating chill that had long since penetrated to his bones. He could no longer feel his left foot. His right hand, gripping the frozen iron of his rifle, was a dead thing, a club of meat he couldn't command. He tried to wiggle the fingers inside his mitten, but the mitten itself was a frozen ball of wool and ice. This was not discomfort. This was the prelude to the end. He squinted against the wind, his eyelashes thick with frost. The world had shrunk to a tunnel of blinding white and a pain so vast it had become abstract. He wasn't just cold, he was being consumed by the absence of heat. He thought of his cabin 2 miles down the drainage, a small dark shape he could barely picture. 2 miles was an eternity. He knew the signs. The cold was making him slow, making him stupid. A dull, pleasant wish to simply sit down, to rest his back against a snow-covered boulder was creeping into his mind. It was a liar's wish, the mountain's final gentle invitation to die. He fought it, his breath catching as a fresh gust hit him, stealing the air from his lungs. The wind didn't just blow against him. It blew through him. The seams of his coat, sewn with common cotton thread, had given way at the shoulder, and the ice wind was pouring in, a direct assault on his core. He fumbled with his frozen hand, trying to pull the collar tighter, but his fingers were useless. He knew, with a sudden, terrible clarity, that he was building his life wrong. It wasn't just this trip. It was everything. His gear, his preparations, the wisdom he'd brought from the Ohio valleys. It was all useless up here, where the sky met the stone. He was dressed like a farmer, and the mountain was treating him as such. He stumbled, falling face first into a drift, the impact driving the air from him in a painful gasp. The snow packed into the gap in his shoulder, a searing, instant burn. He lay there for a long moment, the world silent save for the shriek of the wind and the frantic, muffled beating of his own heart. He would die here, he realized, not from a grizzly or a Blackfoot arrow, but from a poorly sewn seam and wet wool. It was a pathetic, ignominious end. That thought, the sheer stupidity of it, gave him a jolt of rage that was clearer and hotter than any fire. He would not die for a cotton thread. He forced himself up, a grotesque figure of ice and misery, and began the agonizing, stumbling descent. Not just a man fleeing the cold, but a man fleeing his own catastrophic ignorance. Jedediah had arrived in the high country 2 years prior in 1834, full of the misplaced confidence of a man who knew how to handle an axe and a plow. He was 28 years old, strong, and possessed a quiet stubbornness. He had come west to trap beaver, to make his fortune in plues, and escape the crowded, tamed lands back east. Like all the new men, he had outfitted himself in St. Louis, buying what the merchants recommended. He wore thick wool trousers, a flannel shirt, and a factory-made wool capote, a heavy hooded coat that was the standard issue for trappers and voyageurs alike. For warmer weather, or for going Indian as they called it, he had a suit of buckskin, traded from a crow hunting party. It was thin, almost delicate, and decorated with intricate quill work. It looked the part, and for a summer on the prairie it served well enough. But the prairie was not the high ridge, and summer was not the season of the ice wind. His first winter had been a brutal education. The wool trousers, when wet, took 3 days to dry by a fire, and in the process they steamed him, chilling him from the outside in. The heavy wool capote was worse. It was a magnet for burrs, snow, and rain. When he knelt to set a trap in the icy water, the sleeves would soak, and by the time he stood up, they would be freezing into stiff, abrasive cuffs. He had spent that first winter in a state of perpetual, agonizing dampness. The buckskin was a different kind of failure. The first time he was caught in a freezing rain, the supple, smoked hide had transformed. It absorbed the water, and then, as the temperature plummeted, it froze into something resembling iron plate. He could barely bend his arms or legs. The suit, which had been comfortable when dry, became a cage of ice. He had been forced to cut the leggings off with his knife, his skin purple and numb beneath. That was when he had his first near disaster. A seam in his buckskin shirt, sewn with the same weak cotton thread as his capote, split open down his back while he was hoisting a log. The sudden exposure to the 0-degree air felt like a hot brand on his skin. He had huddled in his lean-to, shivering violently, trying to repair the damage with half-frozen fingers, cursing the men who sold this trash to trappers. He was always cold, always fixing his gear. His life was a constant battle, not against the wilderness, a concept too grand for his daily misery, but against the simple, brutal physics of moisture and wind. He spent more energy fighting his own clothing than he did trapping beaver. He saw the older trappers, men who had been in the mountains for a decade, and he saw the Shoshone and the Crow. They moved differently. They didn't seem to be fighting the cold so much as ignoring it. They moved with a fluid ease, their clothing rustling softly, not crackling and snapping like his own. He was exhausted, frustrated, and his pile of plues was pitifully small. He was too cold to work effectively. He was a failure, kept alive only by a strong constitution and a deep well of luck, and he knew both were running out. His cabin was a sanctuary, but a flawed one. He would return, half-frozen, and spend the night huddled by his fire, turning himself like a piece of meat on a spit. One side roasting, this other freezing. His gear would hang from the rafters, dripping endless Melton-G puddles onto the dirt floor, steaming up the small space but never truly getting dry. He was living in a perpetual state of damp, cold, and repair. This was not survival. It was a slow-motion catastrophe. He looked at his frozen, ruined leggings after the incident on the Ridge Trail, the ones he'd had to shatter with the butt of his axe to get off his legs, and he knew something had to change from the ground up. He couldn't buy the solution. The solution didn't exist in St. Louis. It had to be built here, from the materials of the mountain itself. That spring, after the thaw, Jedediah made a decision. He cached his traps and took his meager bundle of furs, not down to the rendezvous to trade for whiskey and powder, but south, into the valley of the Popo Agie. He traveled not as a trapper, but as a student. He knew the Shoshone wintered there, and he sought them out, swallowing the pride that had kept him independent and foolish for 2 years. He found their camp, a quiet collection of skin lodges nestled in a cottonwood grove, sheltered from the prevailing west wind. He approached with caution, his rifle held loosely, making the sign for trade and peace. He was met by an older man, his face a map of sun and wind, whose name he came to know as Taza. Jed didn't speak Shoshone, and Taza spoke only a few words of trader's French, but language proved unnecessary. Jedediah had questions, and Taza had answers that were worn on his body. For several days, Jed sat and watched. He pointed to his own ruined wool coat, then made a gesture of shivering, of wind passing through. Taza understood. He touched the sleeve of Jed's coat, rubbed the wet, matted wool between his fingers, and shook his head with a look that was not quite pity, but simple acknowledgment of a bad tool. Then Taza showed him his own. He brought out his winter robe, a massive, heavy thing made from a prime bison bull hide. Jed reached out to touch it, expecting the stiff, rawhide feel of the pelts he traded. Instead, his fingers sank into fur an inch deep, indescribably soft and thick. Taza turned it over. The hide side was not hard, but supple, pliable, and smoked to a dark, rich brown. Taza gestured, mimicking the act of scraping, then rubbing, then holding the hide in the smoke. He was showing him the brain-tanning process, a laborious alchemical transformation that made the hide permanently soft and water-resistant. But the robe was only the beginning. Taza wore a shirt made of 2 full antelope skins, brain-tanned to the softness of linen. He showed Jed the seams. They were not sewn with thread, but with sinew, the long, tough fibers taken from the backstrap of a deer. Taza pulled at a seam with all his strength. It did not budge. He then took a water cup and poured a few drops onto the seam. Jed watched, astonished, as the dried sinew absorbed the moisture, swelled, and sealed the stitch hole completely tight. A cotton seam gaped when wet. A sinew seam became waterproof. This was the first revelation. The second was the design. Taza's clothing was not tailored, it was engineered. The shirt was cut loose with gussets under the arms, allowing him to draw a bow or throw a spear without the garment binding. Jed saw that the fur on the robe was worn, facing inward. It was a simple, profound insight. The fur trapped his own body heat against his skin, creating a pocket of warm, dead air. The smoked, toughened hide faced outward, breaking the wind and shedding the snow. His own coat did the opposite, letting the wind pass through the wool to chill the skin, while the fur trim on his collar was a useless frozen decoration. Taza showed him his moccasins, cut large from thick moose hide. He pulled one off and showed Jed what was inside. A thick, replaceable mat of dried grass and rabbit fur, a disposable insulating liner. Jed thought of his own frozen leather boots, which held the cold and offered no insulation at all. He observed the women, the masters of this craft. He watched them for hours, their hands moving with practiced rhythmic grace, pushing a sharpened bone or metal awl through the tough hide, pulling the sinew tight with a swift, powerful jerk. He saw the fringes, realizing they weren't just for show. They were a brilliant technology, wicking water away from the main garment, allowing it to drip off before it could soak the body. He stayed for a week, trading his last few traps and a good knife for a cured bison hide, several bundles of prepared sinew, and the knowledge to use them. He left that camp a different man. He was no longer a trapper. He was an apprentice. He returned to his cabin not with goods, but with a plan, a set of principles. Fur in, hide out, sinew seams, and a loose, layered cut. Jedediah spent the summer of 1836 not trapping, but hunting with a new, desperate focus. He was not hunting for fur to trade. He was hunting for materials to build his survival. He needed specific animals, specific hides. He stalked and killed a large bull bison that had wandered up from the plains, a dangerous and difficult hunt that he undertook alone. He spent a full day skinning the massive animal, careful to make the cuts clean, preserving the integrity of the hide. He needed antelope and deer for the inner layers, hides that could be tanned to an almost cloth-like softness. He needed beaver, not for the plume, but for the dense, oily fur that would become mittens. He even took a large gray wolf, its pelt thick and silver, knowing that ruff of fur around a hood could mean the difference between a seeing eye and a frozen one. The trapping was the easy part. The work that followed was the most demanding labor he had ever known. He was not a tanner, and he learned through painful, smelly, back-breaking trial and error. He built a scraping beam and, using the dull side of his knife and a sharpened piece of elk antler, he spent days scraping every last vestige of flesh and fat from the hides. The bison hide was a monster, nearly too big for him to handle alone. He stretched it on a frame and began the braining process. He used the animal's own brain, mixed with liver and soap root, creating a greasy, potent mash that he rubbed deep into the fibers of the hide. This emulsion, he had learned, was what coated the fibers and prevented them from gluing together, the secret to permanent softness. Then came the breaking. For the hide to become buckskin, its fibers had to be stretched, twisted, and broken while it dried. He worked the antelope hides first, smaller and more manageable. He pulled them back and forth over a blunted stake driven into the ground, his arms and back screaming in protest. He worked until his hands were raw, until the hide transformed from a stiff, pale parchment into a soft, white, pliable material. Finally, he smoked them over a smoldering, punky cottonwood fire, hanging them inside a small skin tent. The smoke penetrated the hide, turning it a deep tan, making it water-resistant, and giving it the sweet, sharp smell of the frontier. He repeated this, day after day, for every hide. The bison hide nearly defeated him. It took him a week to work it, his muscles cramping, his hands bleeding, but he persisted, driven by the memory of the ice on the ridge trail. When it was done, it was a masterpiece, 5 pounds of hide, an inch of fur, yet as flexible as a blanket. Only then did the design begin. He laid his old, ruined wool capote on the cabin floor as a rough pattern, but he modified it based on Taza's lessons. He cut it longer, to his knees. He designed a large, pointed hood, big enough to wear over a fur cap. He cut the antelope skins into a long shirt, adding wide gussets under the arms. He made leggings that tied to a belt, not trousers that would bind and split. He spent his evenings by the fire, not resting, but preparing his thread. He split the long strands of deer sinew, rolling them against his thigh into perfect, strong cords. His old awl, a piece of a broken file he'd ground to a point, became his most important tool. He sat, night after night, the cabin filled with the smell of smoked hide and the faint, dusty scent of dried sinew. He punched each hole with the awl, pushed the sinew through, and pulled each stitch with a grunt, sinking it deep into the hide. It was not sewing, it was construction. He was building armor. The work consumed him. Autumn arrived, the aspen turning a brilliant, fiery yellow, and Jedediah was still hunched over his labor. He was no longer just a trapper. He was a craftsman, an engineer obsessed with a single project. He built the main garment first, the bison capote. The fur was turned inward, a dense, dark ocean of insulation. The smoked hide, turned outward, he meticulously rubbed with bear grease, working it into the pores until the hide was slick and waterproof, gleaming in the firelight. He built the hood tall, and around its edge, he sewed the ruff of wolf fur. This was a piece of pure genius he'd seen on Taza. The long, uneven guard hairs of the wolf fur would catch the snow, and more importantly, disrupt the wind, creating a pocket of still, warm air around his face, preventing the frostbite that so often claimed a man's nose and cheeks. He built the inner shirt from the 2 softest antelope hides, the seams perfectly flat so they wouldn't chafe. He cut long fringes along the shoulders and sleeves, not for decoration, but as channels for water to run off. He built the leggings from thick buckskin, overlapping them with his moccasins. The moccasins themselves were new, made from heavy, smoked moose hide, 2 sizes too large, ready to be stuffed with dry grass and spare rabbit fur. Finally, he built the mittens. He used beaver fur, the soft, dense underfur facing in, the greased hide facing out. He made them large, with no separate finger, just a thumb, so his fingers could share warmth. He attached them to a long leather thong that went around his neck, so he could slip one off to bait a trap without losing it in the snow. By the time the first snows of October dusted the high peaks, the suit was complete. It stood on a peg in his cabin, a massive, intimidating silhouette. It was heavy, bulky, and smelled strongly of smoke and grease. It looked primal, half human, half bison. His friend Silas, another free trapper who had come by to trade for powder, had seen it and laughed. "Going to scare the beaver clean out of the valley in that, Jed," he'd chuckled, comfortable in his own store-bought wool. Jedediah had just nodded, running his hand over a sinew seam. "Maybe," he'd said, his voice quiet, "but I reckon I'll be warm." He felt a deep, resonant connection to the suit. His blood and sweat were literally in its fibers. He had put every lesson, every scar, every moment of frozen desperation from the last 2 years into its construction. It was not just clothing. It was a physical manifestation of his will to live, a fortress built of fur and hide. He did not know if it would work. He had followed the principles, but the mountain was the only true test. He looked at the awl, its wooden handle dark with his own hand grease, and set it on his shelf. The work was done. Now he just had to wait for the wind. The test came in late November. A storm, born in the northern ice fields, descended on the mountains without warning. It was not a simple snowfall. It was a blizzard, an Arctic front, that plunged the temperature to 30 below zero and brought a wind that sounded like cannon fire in the high passes. The ridge trail, the site of his near death, was now a vortex of screaming white chaos. Other trappers, including his friend Silas, were hunkered in their cabins, feeding their fires, the walls creaking under the assault. They would not check their traps for a week. Jedediah Sampson, however, was getting dressed. He pulled on the antelope skin shirt, the brain-tan hide cool and soft against his skin. He stuffed his moose-hide moccasins with sweetgrass and pulled them on. He tied the buckskin leggings to his belt. Finally, he lifted the great bison capote from its peg. He settled its weight on his shoulders, the fur interior instantly enclosing him in a pocket of his own body heat. He pulled the big mittens on and looped the thong around his neck. He raised the hood, settling the wolf fur ruff around his face. He picked up his rifle, his awl tucked in his belt, and stepped out of the cabin. The wind hit him like a solid wall. It was a physical blow that would have staggered him in his old gear, the cold instantly piercing wool and cotton. But now it was different. The wind struck the greased bison hide and split. It could not find purchase. It could not penetrate. He felt the pressure, but not the cold. The snow, which was coming down in horizontal sheets, hit the slick hide and slid off. He walked out of the shelter of the trees and up the incline, heading for the ridge trail. The wolf fur ruff was a miracle. The wind howled, but inside the hood the air was calm. His own warm breath eddied around his cheeks. He could see clearly, his eyelashes free of the frost that had blinded him before. He felt no drafts, no sudden searing cold at his seams. The sinew stitches, swollen with moisture, were as tight as rivets. He felt warm. Not just surviving, but genuinely, deeply warm, as if he were sitting by his own fire. He was a walking cabin. He reached the high pass, the wind at its peak, and for the first time, he stood on the ridge, not as a victim, but as a visitor. He could move. The gussets under the arms of his shirt and coat allowed him to raise his rifle, to scramble over a snow-covered log. His leggings didn't bind. The frozen buckskin cage was a distant memory. He was a man in armor, perfectly adapted to the element he inhabited. The second test came as he was rebaiting a trap near a rock slide. The wind had masked his scent, and he had masked the sound of the wolves. He heard a low growl and looked up to see 3 gray shapes detach themselves from the swirling snow 20 yards away. A small pack, hungry and bold in the storm. He had no time to run, only to react. He raised his rifle but knew he'd only get one. He fired, dropping the lead wolf, and then scrambled for the rock slide, the other two closing in. He dropped his rifle and clawed at the rocks, pulling himself up. One of the wolves leaped, its jaws snapping at his foot. It caught the moccasin, the teeth sinking deep. In his old boots, his ankle would have been shattered. But the oversized grass-filled moccasin collapsed, the wolf's teeth finding only hide and straw. Jed kicked frantically, the thick, smoked moose hide holding, not tearing. He felt a different impact and looked down. The second wolf had leaped onto his back, its claws scrabbling for purchase on the bison hide. It snapped at his neck, but its jaws met the thick, tall collar and the dense wolf fur ruff. It couldn't get a grip. The greased hide was too slick, the fur too thick. Jed bellowed, more rage than fear, and threw himself backward, crushing the animal against the rock face. It yelped and fell. Jed scrambled higher, finding a ledge, and turned, pulling his skinning knife. The wolves circled below, looking up at this strange, bison-shaped creature that shed snow and shrugged off their attacks. They saw no purchase, no weakness. After a long moment, whining in frustration, they faded back into the storm. Jedediah sat on the ledge, his heart hammering, his breath pluming inside his hood. He was unharmed, a small tear in his moccasin, and a long scratch on the back of his capote. That was all. The suit had not just defeated the cold, it had defeated an attack that would have shredded him in his old wool. It was a complete system. He climbed down, retrieved his rifle, and finished his trap line, the validation singing in his blood, warmer than any fire. When the storm finally broke 8 days later, the mountains were transformed into a silent, white landscape. Jedediah was one of the first to emerge. His traps were full. He had worked straight through the blizzard, his cabin serving only as a place to sleep and eat. He was healthy, strong, and his larder was full. That spring, at the 1837 rendezvous on the Bear River, Jedediah Sampson was a different man. He was no longer the desperate, half-frozen greenhorn. He walked into the raucous camp with a quiet confidence, his winter's cache of plues the best of any man's. But it was not his furs that drew their attention. It was what he was wearing. Even in the mild spring, he wore the antelope shirt, the buckskin leggings. They were stained with work and blood, but they were intact. The seams were perfect. His bison capote was rolled and tied to his saddle. The trappers gathered around, men like Silas who had spent the blizzard shivering and burning through their woodpile. They felt the softness of the smoked antelope hide. They ran their hands over the bison robe, marveling at its flexibility. They pulled at the sinew seams and saw that they did not give. "Smells like smoke, Jed," Silas remarked, but there was no mockery in his voice, only respect. "Aye," Jed said, "but it's warm smoke, and it's dry." He explained what he had learned. He didn't preach, he just showed them. He showed them the fur turned inward, the greased outer hide. He explained the sinew stitch, how it tightened when wet. He showed them the loose cut, the wolf fur ruff, the grass-stuffed moccasins. He held up his awl. "This is the tool," he said. "Not the trap. This is what keeps a man alive." The knowledge spread, not like a fire, but like a seed. That summer, the rendezvous was full of men scraping hides. The women of the Shoshone and Flathead, who had possessed this knowledge for centuries, found their brain-tanned hides and sinew thread in high demand. The trappers began to adapt. They didn't copy Jed's suit exactly, but they adopted its principles. They began demanding sinew-sewn garments. They started wearing their bison robes fur-in, as they called it. The capote design, once a simple wool coat, was reborn in smoked greased hide, its hood trimmed with wolf or wolverine fur. Men who had spent years fighting the cold with wool and canvas began to understand the physics of air, moisture, and wind. The change was slow, but it was profound. The next winter, fewer men suffered from frostbite. Men who had been confined to their cabins in deep freeze storms were now able to move, to hunt, to check their lines. The standard of survival had been raised. Jed's innovation, itself a synthesis of European design and indigenous science, became the new vernacular. It was no longer Jed's suit. It was simply winter gear, the right way to build a defense against the ice wind. The knowledge disseminated, person to person, until the sight of a man in a stiff frozen wool coat became the mark of a fool, a greenhorn destined for a shallow, snow-covered grave. The genius of Jedediah's solution was not in one single element, but in the creation of a complete integrated system. Decades later, scientists and engineers would give names to the principles he had mastered through observation and desperate necessity. His antelope skin shirt, worn next to the skin, was the base layer. Brain-tanned hide is porous and soft. It wicked sweat and moisture away from his body, preventing the conductive heat loss that came from damp skin. His old wool and flannel, by contrast, trapped that moisture against him, steaming him in his own sweat. The bison capote was a masterpiece of insulation and shell technology combined. The thick fur, worn inward, was the insulator. Its genius lay in trapping a thick layer of dead air, air warmed by his own body, and holding it fast. The hollow fibers of the bison fur were vastly superior to the solid fibers of wool, trapping more air with less weight. The shell was the outer hide. By smoking it, he had impregnated it with antiseptic, water-resistant oils. By greasing it, he had made it fully waterproof and, most critically, windproof. The greatest enemy in the high country was not the ambient temperature, but the wind chill, which could strip heat from a man's body 30 times faster. Jed's shell made the wind irrelevant. It simply could not pass through. His old wool coat was porous. The wind sliced through it as if it weren't there. The sinew seams were a marvel of material science. Cotton thread, a plant fiber, rots when damp and breaks when frozen. Sinew, an animal protein, is the opposite. It is immensely strong, and its tendency to swell when wet, which would be a flaw in other applications, was its primary virtue here. It sealed its own holes. The wolf fur ruff was a lesson in fluid dynamics, creating a boundary layer of turbulent air that broke up the smooth, deadly flow of the Arctic wind, preventing it from touching the skin of his face. The oversized grass-filled moccasins provided insulation that was both effective and, crucially, replaceable. When the grass liner became compressed or damp with sweat, he could simply throw it out and replace it, ensuring a dry, warm foot every morning. His old leather boots, once wet, stayed wet for days, a guaranteed recipe for frostbite. Jedediah Sampson, with no formal training, had designed and built a technical garment that perfectly addressed heat loss through conduction, convection, radiation, and evaporation. He had created, from the animals at his feet, a suit of armor that outperformed anything the civilized world could produce. It was a perfect piece of frontier engineering, born not from theory, but from the brutal, empirical evidence of the Ridge Trail. Jedediah Sampson trapped in the high country for another decade. He saw the beaver trade collapse, the rendezvous fade into legend, and the first settlers begin to trickle in, their wagon trains struggling through the passes he now knew like the back of his hand. He watched them arrive, saw their thin cloth coats and flimsy boots, and he saw in their shivering forms the same ignorance he had once possessed. He traded his knowledge when he could, showing a mother how to line her children's boots with rabbit fur, or a farmer how to smoke a deer hide to make it last. He eventually guided a wagon train west to the Oregon country, and he was last seen walking toward the great forests of the coast, his bison capote slung over his shoulder, the awl still tucked in his belt. His suit, the one he had built in 1836, was long gone, worn out, its pieces returned to the earth, the fibers consumed by the same landscape that had provided them. But the principles endured. the knowledge he had learned from Taza and perfected through trial, the knowledge he had passed on to Silas and the other trappers, became part of the unwritten wisdom of the mountains. It became the quiet difference between comfort and catastrophe. The mountain, Jedediah had come to understand, was not a monster. It was not malicious. It was simply a place with inflexible rules. It did not care about a man's strength, his courage, or his origins. It cared only for physics. It demanded respect for the laws of heat and cold, of wind and water. His first suit of clothes had been an argument with the mountain, an arrogant assumption that the tools of one world would work in another. He had been loud, and he had been wrong. His second suit was a conversation. It was an act of profound listening. He had looked at the bison, the wolf, and the antelope, and he had asked, "How do you survive here?" And they had answered. He realized that survival was not a battle against nature, but an agreement with it. It was the humility to observe what works, and the diligence to replicate it with the materials at hand. The greatest innovations are often not inventions, but translations. The difference between life and death, comfort and misery, is not brute force. It is design. It is the wisdom to see the solution that is already there, and the patience to build it, stitch by stitch, before the ice wind begins to rise.